There's a mineral most Americans have never heard of, yet it's quietly reshaping the global order, and Mexico is sitting on mountains of it. While Washington obsesses over tariffs and border walls, Beijing has been executing a decades-long strategy that's about to flip the economic balance of the entire Western Hemisphere. And here's what should terrify every policymaker in D.C. Trump's confrontational approach didn't just fail to counter China's expansion, it accelerated it. We're talking about lithium, graphite, and rare earth elements. The lifeblood of every electric vehicle, solar panel, and advanced weapon system that will define 21st century power. China doesn't just mine these materials, they control 80% of global processing capacity. They've locked down supply chains from Africa to South America while we were distracted. But Mexico has become the sleeper giant in this story. They possess vast reserves of lithium in Sonora, and Beijing knows something Washington refuses to acknowledge. Whoever controls the energy transition controls the future. The question isn't whether America will lose its economic dominance. It's whether we'll even recognize the world order that's emerging while our political theater distracts us from the most consequential resource war of our lifetime. This isn't about ideology anymore, it's about survival in a world where the rules have fundamentally changed. Let me be very clear about what we're witnessing here, because the mainstream narrative has gotten this completely wrong. When historians look back at this moment 50 years from now, they won't be talking about tweets or campaign rallies or even the border crisis that dominated our headlines. They'll be studying how the United States sleepwalked into the greatest strategic miscalculation since the fall of the Soviet Union, and how Mexico emerged from our shadow to become an independent power broker in a multipolar world that Washington still refuses to acknowledge exists. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen by accident. It happened because while American foreign policy was being driven by sound bites and electoral cycles, China was playing a completely different game with a completely different time frame, and Mexico made a calculated decision about which side of history it wanted to be on. I've spent 40 years studying economic development, watching nations rise and fall, observing how power shifts from one hemisphere to another. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that what's happening right now with critical minerals isn't just another commodity cycle. This is a fundamental restructuring of global economic architecture, and the speed at which it's unfolding should alarm anyone who cares about America's future prosperity. The Trump administration came into office promising to make America great again, to bring back manufacturing, to stand up to China, to put America first. And what actually happened? We alienated our closest neighbors, weaponized trade policy without a coherent strategy, and handed Beijing the greatest gift they could have asked for: proof to the rest of the world that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. You cannot bully your way to prosperity in the 21st century. You cannot tweet your way to technological supremacy. And you absolutely cannot ignore the laws of geology and chemistry when planning your economic future. Here's what Trump and his advisors fundamentally misunderstood about the modern global economy. The old playbook, the one that worked from 1945 to maybe 2008, was built on American military dominance, dollar hegemony, and control over energy supplies through our relationships in the Middle East. That world is gone. It's not coming back. The new world, the world that's already here, whether we acknowledge it or not, runs on batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, electric motors, and the advanced semiconductors that make all of this technology possible. And every single one of these technologies depends on minerals that the United States does not produce in significant quantities and has no immediate capacity to produce even if we wanted to. We're talking about lithium for batteries, cobalt for battery cathodes, rare earth elements for motors and magnets, graphite for anodes, nickel for high energy density batteries, and copper in quantities we've never seen before. These aren't luxury items or nice-to-haves. These are the foundational building blocks of the next economy, the same way steel and oil were the foundational building blocks of the 20th century economy. China understood this 30 years ago, not 5 years ago, not during the Obama administration, but back in the 1990 seconds, when Deng Xiaoping reportedly said that the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. They've been systematically cornering the market on these materials ever since. Not through military conquest, not through the kind of crude imperialism that characterized European colonialism, but through patient investment, strategic partnerships, higher tolerance for environmental costs, and a willingness to play the long game that democracies with four-year election cycles simply cannot match. They bought mines in Australia, Congo, Chile, and Argentina. They built processing facilities that no one else wanted to build because the work is dirty, toxic, and unprofitable in the short term. They subsidized their domestic industry to a degree that made it impossible for Western competitors to survive. And most importantly, they created dependencies that now define the global supply chain. When you buy an electric vehicle in America, when you install solar panels on your roof in California, when the Pentagon builds advanced weapon systems, you are dependent on Chinese processing of critical minerals. Whether you realize it or not, this isn't a hypothetical future threat. This is the reality right now, today. Now, let's talk about Mexico, because this is where the story gets really interesting and really concerning for American strategic interests. Mexico has been in America's backyard for so long that we've taken the relationship for granted. We assume that geographic proximity, cultural ties, economic integration through NAFTA, and later USMCA, and shared security concerns would naturally keep Mexico in the American orbit regardless of how we treated them. That assumption is crumbling before our eyes. Mexico has substantial lithium deposits, particularly in Sonora and other northern states. The Mexican government under López Obrador nationalized lithium extraction in 2022, declaring it a strategic national resource that would be controlled by the state, not by foreign corporations. This was a direct response to decades of watching their oil wealth extracted by foreign companies while ordinary Mexicans remained poor. But it was also a signal that Mexico intends to be a player in the new energy economy, not just a supplier of cheap labor and raw materials to its northern neighbor. And who did Mexico turn to for expertise in lithium extraction and processing? Not American companies, not Canadian firms. They've been in negotiations and discussions with Chinese companies who have decades of experience doing exactly this work, who have the technology, the capital, and most importantly, the willingness to engage on terms that respect Mexican sovereignty rather than demanding the kind of neo-colonial arrangements that Washington has historically preferred. This is catastrophic for American strategic interests, and I don't use that word lightly. Imagine a scenario entirely plausible within the next decade, where electric vehicles manufactured in Mexico using Mexican lithium processed with Chinese technology are exported to the American market under USMCA rules, generating wealth and jobs for Mexico and China, while American workers are left wondering what happened to the green economy they were promised. Imagine a scenario where the Department of Defense needs to source materials for weapons systems and discovers that the most cost-effective and reliable supply chains run through Mexico City and Beijing rather than through allied nations. This isn't science fiction. This is the logical consequence of policies that prioritize short-term political theater over long-term strategic planning. The Trump approach to Mexico was almost perfectly calibrated to accelerate this shift. The constant threats to tear up trade agreements, the insults, the border wall rhetoric, the casual racism, and the use of tariffs as a blunt instrument to force cooperation on immigration policy all sent a very clear message to Mexican policymakers. The United States does not view you as a partner. It views you as a subordinate to be commanded. And when you treat a proud nation of 130 million people with one of the most dynamic economies in Latin America as a subordinate, they start looking for alternatives. They start asking themselves why they should align their long-term economic development strategy with a country that might elect a completely different government with completely different priorities every 4 years. They start taking meetings with Chinese diplomats who arrive with delegation after delegation, with financing offers, with technology transfer agreements, and with infrastructure proposals that don't come with lectures about democracy, human rights, and governance reforms. I want to be clear about something, because I know how this sounds to some people. I am not pro-China. I am not anti-America. I am pro-reality. And the reality is that American foreign policy has been living in a fantasy world for at least 2 decades, maybe longer. We toppled governments in the Middle East without any plan for what comes next and created power vacuums that strengthened Iran and Russia. We expanded NATO right up to Russia's borders, despite warnings from our own diplomats that this would be viewed as an existential threat and could lead to conflict. We launched a trade war with China without first securing our own supply chains or building alliances with other nations who share our concerns about Chinese economic practices. We treated climate change as a political football rather than as the civilizational threat that it obviously is, which meant we were late, catastrophically late, to the energy transition that is now reshaping global power dynamics. And we did all of this while running up massive deficits, allowing our infrastructure to crumble, watching our education system fall behind international competitors, and permitting inequality to reach levels not seen since the Gilded Age. These are not the actions of a serious country with a coherent strategy. These are the actions of a declining empire that doesn't yet realize it's declining. The critical minerals crisis is a microcosm of all of these failures. We knew for decades that rare earth elements were strategically important. We had our own rare earth mine in California's Mountain Pass that was shut down because we couldn't compete with Chinese subsidies and because the environmental regulations made it unprofitable. We could have maintained that capacity for strategic reasons, the same way we maintain military bases that aren't profitable. We could have invested in research and development to find alternative materials or more efficient extraction processes. We could have built diplomatic coalitions with Australia, Canada, Chile, and other resource-rich democracies to create supply chains that didn't run through Beijing. We did none of these things. And now we're in a position where China can potentially cut off access to materials that are essential for everything from fighter jets to smartphones. Our main plan seems to be hoping that somehow the free market will solve a problem that is fundamentally about state capacity and long-term planning. Mexico's pivot toward China on critical minerals is happening in the context of a much broader transformation in Latin America. For 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine and American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere was simply a fact of life. The United States had the military power, the economic weight, and the political influence to essentially determine outcomes in Latin American countries. We overthrew governments we didn't like in Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. We supported dictators who were favorable to American business interests. We used the IMF and World Bank to impose structural adjustment programs that opened Latin American markets to American corporations while demanding austerity for ordinary citizens. For a long time, there was no alternative. The Soviet Union was too far away and too focused on other regions. Europe was rebuilding after World War II. China was still a poor country, but that world doesn't exist anymore. China is now the largest trading partner for Brazil, Chile, and Peru. They've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in Latin American infrastructure, mining, agriculture, and energy. They offer financing without the political conditions that come with Western loans. They don't lecture Latin American leaders about democracy or human rights. They show up with money, with technology, and with a simple proposition: let's do business. Latin American countries, including Mexico, are making a rational calculation. They're asking themselves why they should remain junior partners in an American-led system that has delivered mediocre results for their populations when they could diversify their partnerships and potentially get better deals from a rising power that's actively courting them. This is especially true on issues like climate change and energy transition, where China is the world leader in solar panel manufacturing, wind turbine production, electric vehicle technology, and battery production. If you're a Mexican policymaker trying to figure out how to develop your lithium resources and move your economy toward clean energy, who are you going to partner with? The country that just elected a president who called climate change a hoax and pulled out of the Paris Agreement? Or the country that's dominating every sector of the clean energy economy and is actively looking for partners? The tragedy of Trump's approach is that it was entirely unnecessary. There was a pathway to maintaining American influence in Latin America and competing effectively with China. But it required something that his administration was fundamentally incapable of: strategic patience, diplomatic sophistication, and genuine respect for the sovereignty and aspirations of other nations. Instead of threatening Mexico, we could have invested in the joint development of their lithium resources, with American companies taking minority stakes and Mexican workers and engineers running the operations. Instead of imposing tariffs, We could have worked to harmonize environmental and labor standards across North America so that we're competing with China on a level playing field defined by our values. Instead of building walls, we could have been building supply chains that tie our economies together so tightly that decoupling becomes unthinkable for both sides. But that's not what happened. What we chose was confrontation, unilateralism, and short-term political wins over long-term strategic positioning. Let me tell you what keeps me up at night as someone who has studied development economics and geopolitics for most of my adult life. It's not that China is rising. Rising powers are a normal feature of history, and in many ways, China's economic development has been remarkable and has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which is unambiguously good for humanity. What keeps me up at night is that the United States seems unable or unwilling to adapt to a world where we're no longer the unquestioned hegemon. We can't seem to accept that other countries have their own interests and their own agency. We can't seem to understand that military superiority doesn't translate into economic dominance in the 21st century the way it did in the 20th. We can't seem to learn from our mistakes, whether in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, or in our trade policy. And most frighteningly, we can't seem to have an honest conversation about any of this because our political system has become so polarized and dysfunctional that any nuanced discussion of foreign policy gets reduced to simplistic narratives about who's tough on China or who loves America more. The minerals crisis is a perfect example of this dysfunction. This should not be a partisan issue. Republicans and Democrats should both be able to agree that having secure access to the materials that are essential for economic competitiveness and national security is important. We should be able to have a rational discussion about the trade-offs involved in mining these materials domestically, including the environmental costs, the economic costs, and the time required to build out this capacity. We should be able to work with allies and partners to create resilient supply chains that don't depend on any single country. We should be able to invest in research and development to find substitutes for the most problematic materials or to develop recycling technologies that reduce our dependence on primary extraction. These are technical, practical problems with technical, practical solutions. But instead, we get conspiracy theories, nationalist posturing, and policies that are designed to win news cycles rather than solve problems. And while we're having these unserious conversations, Mexico is moving forward. They're developing their resources. They're building relationships with multiple powers, not just China, but also the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and others. They're positioning themselves to be a critical node in the global supply chains of the future. They're investing in education and infrastructure. They're taking advantage of nearshoring trends where companies want to move production closer to the American market but don't want to deal with American labor costs or regulatory complexity. Mexico could become one of the great success stories of the 21st century. And if they do, it will be in spite of American policy, not because of it. That should be a moment of national shame for the United States, our closest neighbor, a country with whom we share thousands of miles of border, with whom millions of families have connections on both sides, and with whom our economies are deeply integrated, is slipping out of our orbit because we couldn't treat them with basic respect and dignity. The deeper issue here is about the nature of power in the modern world. Trump and many in the American foreign policy establishment still think about power in very traditional terms. Military might, economic sanctions, the ability to coerce and compel. And those things still matter, don't get me wrong, but they matter less than they used to, and they matter in different ways. The real power in the 21st century comes from being essential to networks that other countries need and want to be part of. China has made itself essential to global supply chains. They've made themselves essential to developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. They've made themselves essential to the energy transition through their dominance in clean technology. That's power. That's the kind of power that's harder to counter and harder to replace. America used to have that kind of power. We were essential to global security through NATO and our alliance system. We were essential to global finance through the dollar and our capital markets. We were essential to global technology through Silicon Valley and our research universities. We're losing that essentiality piece by piece, and the minerals crisis is just one symptom of a much larger problem. So what do we do about this? How do we respond to Mexico's rise and to the reality that China has outmaneuvered us on critical minerals? Well, the first step is honesty. We need to be honest about how we got here. This isn't just about Trump. Although his policy certainly accelerated negative trends, this is about decades of bipartisan failure to invest in our own country, to take our relationships with neighbors seriously, to plan for the long term, and to understand that the world is changing and we need to change with it. The second step is humility. We need to accept that other countries don't exist to serve American interests. Mexico has every right to develop its resources in ways that benefit Mexican citizens. China has every right to compete for influence and to build relationships that serve its interests. Our job is not to prevent other countries from rising, but to ensure that we remain competitive and that we're building a world order that reflects our values of democracy, human rights, and sustainability. The third step is investment. We need a massive, sustained investment in the foundations of our economy: infrastructure, education, research and development, domestic manufacturing capacity, and supply chain resilience. This can't just be talking points in political campaigns. This needs to be a generational commitment backed by serious money and serious policy. And finally, we need a completely different approach to diplomacy, especially with our neighbors in Latin America. Instead of lecturing, we need to listen. Instead of demanding, we need to negotiate. Instead of assuming loyalty, we need to earn it by being a reliable, respectful partner that helps other countries achieve their development goals, rather than just extracting resources and exploiting cheap labor. This is difficult for a country that has been the dominant power for so long. It requires letting go of habits and assumptions that are deeply embedded in how we think about ourselves and our role in the world. But if we don't make this shift, if we continue down the path of nationalist posturing and unilateral action, we're going to wake up one day to find that the world has moved on without us, that the networks of trade, technology, and influence that define power in the 21st century all run through other capitals, and that we've become a declining power shouting at clouds while the future is built somewhere else. Mexico's rise is inevitable. It's a country with extraordinary human capital, abundant natural resources, a strategic geographic position, and a young population. They're going to develop and prosper regardless of what we do. The question is whether they do it in partnership with the United States or whether they do it despite the United States. Right now, we're pushing them toward the latter option, and that is a strategic catastrophe that will echo for generations. Trump's fall, politically speaking, creates an opportunity to rethink these relationships, but only if we're willing to fundamentally reassess the assumptions that have guided American foreign policy. The secret mineral behind China's strategy isn't really a secret at all. It's lithium, rare earths, cobalt, and all the materials that power the future. And the real secret is that China understood the importance of these materials before we did, planned for their acquisition before we did, and built the industrial capacity to process them before we did. We can catch up, but it requires the kind of sustained national effort that America is capable of when we decide something truly matters. The question is whether we'll make that decision before it's too late.